Case 1. James Ruppert. In the late afternoon of March 30, 1975, police officers in Hamilton, Ohio, pulled up to a quiet two-story brick residence on Minor Avenue. Inside, 11 members of a single family lay deceased across the living room and kitchen, their holiday gathering transformed into the deadliest domestic mass shooting in state history. The perpetrator was not a fleeing stranger, but a quiet, 41-year-old family member who walked out the front door, placed his hands on his head, and calmly surrendered to the responding authorities. To understand how a routine Easter Sunday dinner dissolved into an unprecedented crime scene, we have to go back to the origins of a deeply fractured family dynamic. James Urban Ruppert was born in 1934 into an environment marked by emotional distance and strict expectations. Growing up during the Great Depression, his family prioritized financial survival over emotional support. His father was a cold, distant figure who frequently expressed disappointment, while his mother, Charity Ruppert, held firm expectations regarding personal success and domestic stability. James lived under the shadow of his older brother, Leonard Jr., who excelled academically, athletic-wise, and socially. While Leonard built a successful career as an engineer, married, and raised a large family, James struggled with severe feelings of inadequacy. As he reached adulthood, James attempted to establish independence, but repeated personal and professional setbacks drew him back to his childhood home. He suffered from chronic low self-esteem, deep-seated insecurity, and a growing perception that his family viewed him as a failure. He felt increasingly isolated, convinced that those closest to him held him in contempt. Beneath his quiet, unassuming exterior, an intense resentment was forming. James developed an obsession with firearms, collecting various pistols and rifles while spending long hours alone. His psychological profile revealed a man harboring profound envy toward his brother's prosperous life. Every family achievement highlighted his own lack of progress, feeding a conviction that his family was actively marginalizing him. The small compromises in his life began years prior. James stopped pursuing steady employment, choosing instead to live off modest savings and small handouts from his mother. He spent his days drinking at local taverns, where he occasionally voiced paranoid suspicion that his mother and brother were conspiring to deprive him of his rightful inheritance. Friends and acquaintances brushed off these comments as minor grievances, unaware that his internal narrative was growing increasingly dangerous. By early 1975, James was entirely dependent on his mother, living in her upstairs bedroom while facing total financial exhaustion. His brother Leonard brought his family over frequently, and every interaction reinforced James's sense of personal humiliation. Rather than seeking help, James spent weeks isolating himself, contemplating a definitive end to his perceived mistreatment. When officers entered the Minor Avenue residence on that March afternoon, they uncovered a scene of absolute calculation. Neighbors had reported hearing loud noises, but no one suspected that 11 people had just lost their lives. James himself had called the police dispatcher, stating in a flat tone that an emergency had occurred at the house. Forensic technicians from the Hamilton Police Department began a painstaking processing of the interior. They recovered 4 distinct firearms from the scene: a 9mm submachine gun, a .357 Magnum revolver, a .22 caliber rifle, and a .22 caliber pistol. Investigators meticulously documented physical evidence, mapping out trajectory angles and shell casing distributions. The physical evidence quickly disproved any notion of a sudden, chaotic struggle. Ballistic reconstruction demonstrated that James had loaded multiple weapons, positioned himself systematically, and targeted each individual with deliberate accuracy. Shell casings scattered throughout the kitchen and living room revealed that he had moved room to room, reloading his weapons multiple times to ensure no survivors remained. The trajectory analysis showed that several victims were targeted from above, indicating they were seated or attempting to take cover when attacked. During police questioning, James remained unusually calm, offering minimal emotional response to the loss of his mother Charity, his brother Leonard, his sister-in-law Alma, and his 8 nieces and nephews. Leonard III, Michael, Thomas, Carol, David, Teresa, John, and Anne. Prosecutors built a formidable case centered on physical evidence, ballistic tracking, and proof of premeditation. In 1975, James Ruppert stood trial on 11 counts of first-degree murder. The central debate focused entirely on his legal sanity. The defense presented psychiatric experts arguing that James suffered from severe paranoid psychosis, rendering him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his conduct. However, the prosecution countered with evidence of his methodical preparation, his tactical reloading of weapons, and his immediate surrender to police, proving he fully comprehended his actions. The court rejected the insanity defense, finding James guilty on all 11 counts. The judge imposed 11 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never re-enter society. James Ruppert spent the remainder of his life behind bars, dying in prison in June 2020 at the age of 85 after serving more than 45 years. The Ruppert case stands as a sobering study in the dangers of unaddressed psychological decline, internal resentment, and acute family tension. It proves that when profound envy and isolation are allowed to fester behind closed doors, the results can be catastrophic, offering a timeless lesson in the vital importance of early psychological mediation and intervention before grievances turn into tragedy. Case 2, Ronald DeFeo Jr. Around 6:30 p.m. on November 13, 1974, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. burst through the doors of Henry's Bar in Amityville, New York, shouting that someone had shot his parents. A small group of patrons rushed with him to his family's large Dutch colonial home at 112 Ocean Avenue. Inside, they uncovered a scene of quiet horror. 6 members of the DeFeo family lay dead in their respective beds, each having suffered fatal rifle wounds. Within 48 hours, the young man who claimed to be a grieving survivor was led out of Suffolk County Police Department headquarters in handcuffs, charged with the systematic murder of his entire household. To understand how a young man living in an affluent suburban neighborhood became responsible for one of the most infamous domestic massacres in American history, we have to go back to the troubled environment behind those grand front doors. Born in 1951, Ronald DeFeo Jr., known to friends and family as Butch, was the eldest of 5 children. His father, Ronald DeFeo Sr., was a successful manager at a Brooklyn dealership, providing the family with significant financial comfort. However, behind closed doors, the household was dominated by volatile domestic friction. Ronald Sr. was an overbearing, strict disciplinarian who frequently engaged in intense physical and verbal confrontations with his eldest son. His mother, Louise DeFeo, often tried to mediate, but the household remained defined by tension. As Butch grew into adolescence, his father attempted to buy his compliance with expensive gifts, automobiles, and a generous allowance. Instead of instilling responsibility, this dynamic fostered deep resentment, rebellion, and antisocial behavior. Butch developed a reputation as an arrogant, volatile young man with a dangerous temper. He struggled academically, abused illicit substances, and frequently engaged in physical altercations with peers and family members alike. Despite his volatile disposition, his family continued to shield him from legal consequences, providing him with a low-demand job at his grandfather's dealership. The early warning signs of escalating violence were repeatedly ignored. Butch began collecting high-powered firearms, keeping them in his bedroom. Months before the murders, during a heated domestic argument with his father, Butch pointed a loaded shotgun directly at Ronald Sr. and pulled the trigger, but the weapon misfired. Rather than contacting law enforcement or seeking mandatory psychiatric intervention, the family swept the incident under the rug, allowing Butch to remain in the home surrounded by weaponry. By late 19,704, Butch was facing mounting financial troubles, drug dependencies, and deepening resentment toward his parents. The spiral reached a critical threshold in early November when he staged a fake robbery of dealership funds he was tasked with depositing, keeping the money for himself. When his parents questioned his story and threatened to cut off his financial support, Butch realized his lifestyle was coming to an end. When Suffolk County homicide detectives arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue on the night of November 13, they initiated a thorough forensic examination. The deceased included Ronald S.R., 43, Louise, 43, Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John, 9. All 6 victims were found lying face down in their beds, having been targeted with a .35 caliber Marlin lever-action rifle. Forensic technicians quickly identified major flaws in Butch's initial story. He claimed he was at work and out with friends all day, suggesting a mob hitman had entered the home. However, detectives noted a complete absence of forced entry. More critically, physical evidence gathered from the house contradicted his timeline. The medical examiner confirmed all 6 victims had lost their lives during the early morning hours, around 3:00 a.m., long before Butch claimed to have left for work. The turning point occurred when investigators searched Butch's bedroom and recovered empty gun boxes matching the exact make and caliber of the murder weapon. Unfired cartridges found in his room bore identical manufacturing, marks to the shell casings recovered near the victims' beds. Confronted with the overwhelming forensic evidence, Butch abandoned his cover story and confessed, detailing how he had methodically moved from room to room in the quiet hours of the morning, discarding his blood-stained clothes and the rifle in a nearby canal afterward. In October 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. stood trial on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The defense relied heavily on an insanity defense, presenting psychiatric testimony claiming Butch suffered from severe psychosis and heard voices instructing him to eliminate his family. However, prosecution experts presented meticulous evidence showing he acted with clear deliberation, methodically hiding evidence, and constructing an alibi immediately following the crime. The jury rejected the insanity defense, finding DeFeo fully aware of the moral wrongfulness of his actions. In November 1975, he was convicted on all 6 counts and sentenced to 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life. DeFeo spent the rest of his life behind bars, dying in state custody in March 2021 at age 69. The DeFeo case remains a crucial study in forensic objectivity, proving how rigorous evidence collection can dismantle elaborate fabrications and defeat illegitimate legal defenses. It underscores the critical necessity of addressing domestic warning signs and holding volatile individuals accountable long before unaddressed resentment escalates into irreversible tragedy. Case 3. Ronald Gene Simmons. On December 28, 1987, a 49-year-old retired military veteran walked calmly into an oil company office in Russellville, Arkansas, carrying 2 handguns. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, he moved across the small town, targeting specific businesses, taking the lives of 2 individuals, and wounding 4 others before placing his weapons on a counter and asking a secretary to call the police. When law enforcement officers arrested him at the scene, they had no idea that this public shooting spree was merely the final phase of a far larger, terrifying domestic crime scene waiting to be discovered at his secluded rural home. To understand how a decorated military retiree transformed into the perpetrator of one of the deadliest family massacres in American history, we have to examine the rigid control and growing isolation that defined his personal life. Born in 1938, Ronald Gene Simmons spent 20 years serving in the United States Air Force, retiring as a master sergeant. Throughout his military career, he developed a reputation for strict discipline, order, and an absolute demand for obedience. However, behind closed doors, this desire for total control manifested as extreme domestic domination. He subjected his wife, Rebecca, and their children to intense isolation, controlling their finances, their social interactions, and their daily routines. After retiring from the military, Simmons relocated his family to a remote, fenced property in rural Pope County, near Russellville. The property, surrounded by high wooden barricades, was designed to keep the outside world out and his family firmly within his reach. Beneath the outward appearance of a quiet rural life lay severe emotional abuse and deep-seated hostility. Simmons struggled to maintain steady civilian employment, suffering repeated financial setbacks and job terminations that severely eroded his sense of authority. As his children grew older and attempted to establish independent lives, Simmons viewed their efforts as betrayal. He developed an intense, toxic resentment toward family members who resisted his control, as well as former coworkers and employers whom he blamed for his financial difficulties. The early warning signs of escalation were disguised by the family's enforced isolation. Neighbors rarely saw the Simmons family, and those who did noticed a pervasive atmosphere of fear and silence. As Simmons's financial instability deepened throughout 1987, he began formulating a methodical, calculated plan to eliminate everyone he believed had contributed to his perceived degradation. By late December 1987, as family members gathered at his remote residence for the Christmas holiday, Simmons put his plan into motion. Over a multi-day period starting on December 22, he systematically targeted his family as they arrived at the home. He took the lives of his wife Rebecca, their children Billy, Marilyn, Sheila, Loretta, Eddie, and Marion, as well as his daughter-in-law, son-in-law, and 4 young grandchildren. When Pope County Sheriff's deputies searched the secluded property following his arrest on December 28, they uncovered the full scale of the tragedy. 14 members of the Simmons family lay deceased on the property, concealed in outbuildings and inside the residence. Forensic investigators from the Arkansas State Police immediately began processing the 2 distinct crime scenes, the rural family compound and the commercial locations in Russellville, where Simmons had killed business operators George Pegg and Barbara Pegg while wounding 4 others. Physical evidence gathered from the homestead revealed extreme preparation. Investigators recovered a handwritten document, a detailed hit list written by Simmons listing family members, former employers, and specific acquaintances he intended to target. The physical evidence demonstrated complete calculation. Ballistic trajectory analysis and crime scene reconstruction proved that Simmons had acted with deliberate precision over several days, laying traps and waiting for relatives to arrive one by one. There were no signs of a sudden, chaotic struggle, confirming that every phase of the attack was executed according to his written plan. During police questioning, Simmons remained remarkably detached, offering no remorse for his actions and freely admitting to the planning and execution of the massacre. The state of Arkansas charged Simmons with 16 counts of capital murder. When his trial began in 1988, Simmons refused to allow his defense attorneys to present mitigating evidence or pursue an insanity defense. He maintained that he was fully aware of his actions and demanded the ultimate punishment under the law. Psychiatric evaluations confirmed he possessed the legal capacity to understand his crimes and stand trial. In 1989, the jury found Ronald Gene Simmons guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death. True to his court statements, Simmons refused to file appeals, fighting efforts by outside advocacy groups to stay his sentence. On June 25, 1990, Simmons was executed by lethal injection at the Arkansas State Penitentiary. The Simmons case remains a stark, historical warning regarding the fatal intersection of extreme domestic isolation, obsessive control, and unaddressed psychological deterioration. It underscores the critical necessity of community vigilance and early intervention when toxic control and severe isolation cut vulnerable individuals off from the outside world. Case 4. David Francis Brom. On the afternoon of February 18, 1988, administrators at Lourdes High School in Rochester, Minnesota, contacted the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office after a student came forward with a disturbing account. 16-year-old junior David Francis Brom had reportedly made detailed statements during the morning commute suggesting his family had suffered a fatal domestic incident. First responding deputy Kevin Torgerson arrived at the quiet suburban residence on Crestview Lane to conduct a welfare check. Upon entering the second-floor bedrooms, officers discovered 4 deceased members of the Brom family: 41-year-old Bernard Brom, his 41-year-old wife Paulette, 13-year-old Deanne, and 11-year-old Richard. The eldest son, 18-year-old Joseph, was away from the home. Missing from the scene was 16-year-old David. To understand how a quiet high school student in a close-knit community became the central subject of a statewide manhunt, we have to look behind the walls of the household. Born in 1971, David Brom grew up in a traditional, religious family in Rochester. His father, Bernard, worked as an executive at a local technology firm, while his mother, Paulette, was actively involved in church and community activities. Outwardly, the Broms presented an image of suburban stability. David was enrolled at a local private Catholic high school, participating in school functions and maintaining an average academic standing. However, beneath the surface of family life, tension had been escalating for months. David was struggling with severe, unaddressed psychological distress, emotional withdrawal, and deep personal isolation. He developed a growing fascination with dark subcultures and heavy metal music, which led to frequent domestic friction. His parents, concerned by his changing behavior, appearance, and social circle, attempted to enforce stricter household rules and curfews. The early warning signs were mistaken for routine adolescent rebellion. David's internal struggle deepened as he felt increasingly misunderstood and alienated from his parents' expectations. On the evening of February 17, 1988, at approximately 11:30 p.m., an intense argument broke out between David and his father regarding his behavior, personal choices, and household responsibilities. Rather than resolving the dispute, the confrontation pushed David into a critical psychological threshold. Instead of retiring for the night, David remained awake in the basement into the early morning hours of February 18. Around 3:00 a.m., he retrieved a heavy landscaping tool from the basement storage area. He then moved upstairs to the second floor, systematically attacking his sleeping parents, Bernard and Paulette, before targeting his younger siblings, Diane and Richard. Later that morning, he gathered his school supplies and left the residence as if preparing for a routine day. When Olmsted County Sheriff's deputies and Rochester police officers processed the crime scene, forensic technicians focused on physical evidence recovery. In the basement, investigators located the heavy landscaping tool bearing biological traces. Crime scene specialists lifted latent palm prints off the wooden handle that matched David Brom. There were no signs of forced entry, confirming the perpetrator possessed intimate access to the home. Investigators quickly interviewed the female classmate who had spoken to school officials. She revealed that David had approached her during her morning commute and convinced her to skip school with him. While walking together, David calmly detailed the events of the previous night, explaining the argument with his father and describing the subsequent attack in plain, detached terms. Following a regional search, Rochester police officers located David on the morning of February 19 using a public pay phone near a local post office. He was taken into custody without further incident. Due to David's age, initial legal proceedings began in juvenile court, but prosecutors filed a motion to certify him as an adult under the precedent case in Ray DFB. The court granted the transfer, certifying 16-year-old David Brom to stand trial on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Under Minnesota Rule of Criminal Procedure 20.02, the trial proceeded in 2 distinct phases. Phase 1 evaluated guilt and premeditation. The judge restricted psychiatric testimony to Phase 2, instructing the jury to evaluate solely the physical evidence, timeline, and actions. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all 4 counts. Phase 2 focused on legal insanity under the Manhattan standard. 5 psychiatric experts examined David. While all agreed he suffered from severe psychological impairment and depression, 2 prosecution experts testified that he still retained the capacity to understand the moral wrongfulness of his acts. On October 16, 1989, the jury rejected the insanity defense, and the judge sentenced David Brom to consecutive life terms. Decades later, Minnesota passed legislation in 2023 ending life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders, establishing parole eligibility after 15 years. In January 2025, 53-year-old David Brom appeared before the Minnesota Supervised Release Board, expressing remorse and documenting 37 years of institutional rehabilitation. The board approved his transition, and in July 2025, he was transferred to a Twin Cities halfway house under GPS supervision. The Brom case remains a landmark study in recognizing hidden adolescent distress. It underscores the critical necessity of early mental health intervention and highlights the vital role of peer reporting when alarming statements are made within a school community. Case 5, Andrea Yates. On the morning of June 20, 2001, a 36-year-old mother placed a brief call to the Houston Police Department emergency dispatcher, requesting an officer at her home. Moments later, she called her husband, Rusty Yates, telling him it was time to come home from work. When responding officers entered the residential home in a quiet Houston suburb, they uncovered a tragedy that shocked the nation. 5 young children, 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and 6-month-old Mary, lay deceased in the master bedroom. The mother, Andrea Yates, sat calmly in the living room and confessed immediately, surrendering to police without resistance. To understand how a former university nurse and devoted mother became the central figure in one of the most agonizing trials in modern legal history, we must examine the severe, unaddressed medical crisis unfolding behind closed doors. Born in 1964, Andrea Yates excelled academically, worked as a registered nurse, and was widely regarded as a caring, gentle individual. In 1993, she married Rusty Yates, an engineer, and the couple embarked on a deeply religious life, planning to have as many children as nature allowed. However, following the birth of her 4th child in 1999, Andrea experienced a catastrophic mental health collapse. She was diagnosed with severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, suffering from auditory hallucinations, extreme catatonia, and delusions. She made multiple suicide attempts and required repeated stays in psychiatric hospitals. Medical specialists prescribed potent antipsychotic and antidepressant medications, issuing explicit warnings to the family that Andrea should never be left alone with the children, and that having another child would almost certainly trigger a severe psychotic relapse. Despite these medical warnings, the couple had a 5th child, Mary, in late 2000. Following her father's death early the next year, Andrea's condition degraded rapidly. She stopped speaking, neglected self-care, and was consumed by overwhelming religious delusions. Systemic gaps in medical oversight further accelerated the crisis. In the weeks leading up to June 2001, her treating psychiatrist drastically reduced her antipsychotic medication and discharged her from outpatient care, despite clear evidence of active psychosis. Her husband, believing she needed to build independence, left her unattended with the children for a brief 1-hour window between his departure for work and the arrival of his mother. In that short interval, Andrea's severe delusions overwhelmed her reality, leading her to carry out the fatal act. Homicide detectives and forensic technicians from the Houston Police Department carefully processed the crime scene. Physical evidence gathered from the home was unambiguous, matching Andrea's immediate confession. What made the case extraordinary was not a mystery of who committed the act, but rather the psychological paper trail left behind. Investigators subpoenaed thousands of pages of medical records detailing her psychiatric admissions, suicide attempts, and changing prescriptions. These documents established an indisputable history of severe mental illness, demonstrating that Andrea was experiencing profound psychotic delusions that distorted her perception of reality. In 2002, Andrea Yates stood trial for capital murder. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that despite her psychiatric history, she understood the legal wrongfulness of her actions because she dialed emergency services immediately after. The jury rejected her insanity defense, finding her guilty and sentencing her to life imprisonment. However, in 2005, a Texas appeals court overturned the conviction after discovering that a key prosecution expert witness had offered false, misleading testimony regarding a non-existent television episode about postpartum depression. In 2006, Andrea Yates was retried under Texas's strict insanity laws. This time, the defense presented overwhelming psychiatric evidence proving she suffered from severe postpartum psychosis that rendered her completely incapable of discerning right from wrong at the moment of the incident. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea was committed to Cairville State Hospital, a high-security state psychiatric facility, where she remains under medical care to this day. The Andrea Yates case reshaped public understanding of maternal mental health, serving as a catalyst for sweeping medical and legislative reforms across the United States. States enacted mandatory postpartum depression screening protocols, improved psychiatric discharge standards, and created specialized healthcare support networks for mothers. Analyzing these historical cases provides vital insights into police forensics, judicial precedent, and community safety. If you value detailed, fact-driven criminal investigations that focus on evidence, law, and prevention, take a moment to subscribe and click the notification bell. Your support enables us to continue producing educational, advertiser-safe documentary content. Case 6. Steven Sueppel. On the morning of March 23, 2009, emergency dispatchers in Iowa City, Iowa, received a series of urgent calls directing first responders to a quiet residential neighborhood. Firefighters arriving at the Sueppel household encountered smoke rising from the structure, where a small fire had been intentionally set inside. Once officers gained entry, they uncovered a devastating domestic scene. 42-year-old Shannon Sueppel and the couple's 4 young children, 5-year-old Madeline, 3-year-old Anna, 23-month-old Ethan, and 14-month-old Seth, lay deceased in different rooms across the home. Hours later, law enforcement located the missing father, 42-year-old Steven Sueppel, deceased inside his vehicle following a high-speed collision along Interstate 80 near the Iowa River. To understand how a prominent banking executive living an outwardly successful, active life reached a point of catastrophic destruction, we must examine the hidden corporate fraud and mounting legal pressure unfolding behind his professional persona. Born and raised in Iowa, Steven Sueppel was a well-known figure in the local community. He was a devout parishioner, a respected youth coach, and an accomplished executive who served as the vice president and chief financial officer of the University of Iowa Community Credit Union. Outwardly, Sueppel embodied the image of professional achievement and domestic stability. He lived in an upscale home, maintained an active social profile, and raised a young family with his wife, Shannon. However, beneath this polished exterior, Sueppel was hiding a massive white-collar financial crime that had been compounding for years. Beginning around 2000, he began systematically misappropriating funds from his employer. Using his executive position and intimate knowledge of internal accounting systems, Sueppel altered financial records, forged internal ledgers, and diverted money into personal accounts under his control. The early warning signs were disguised by his professional standing and trusted reputation. His colleagues viewed him as meticulous and dedicated, never suspecting that his lifestyle was being underwritten by stolen institutional capital. Over the course of 7 years, Sueppel embezzled more than $560,000 from the credit union to cover personal expenses, investments, and lifestyle upkeep. The inevitable collapse began in late 2007, when internal auditors uncovered accounting irregularities within the credit union's operations. Facing an internal inquiry, Sueppel resigned from his position in February 2008. Federal authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Attorney's Office, launched a comprehensive forensic audit into his financial activities. In February 2009, Sueppel was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple counts of embezzlement and wire fraud. The public exposure severely shattered Sueppel's identity. Facing an upcoming trial, massive restitution demands, the total loss of his professional reputation, and a mandatory federal prison sentence, his psychological state degraded rapidly. Rather than confronting the legal consequences, he allowed acute shame, professional humiliation, and financial desperation to overwhelm his reality. In the early morning hours of March 23, 2009, Sueppel carried out a planned attack against his wife and children inside their home. Following the incident, he attempted to ignite a fire inside the residence to destroy the scene, left suicide notes on his computer, and sent voicemail messages to his extended family expressing remorse. He then drove his vehicle at high speed directly into a bridge abutment along the Iowa River, ending his life before law enforcement could intercept him. Detectives from the Iowa City Police Department worked alongside state arson investigators and federal agents to reconstruct the events. Forensic processing of the home revealed no signs of external forced entry, establishing that Sueppel acted alone. Physical evidence gathered from the scene, combined with the digital documents recovered from his computer, provided clear proof of calculation. Digital forensics specialists recovered letters created hours before the fire, in which Sueppel detailed his overwhelming despair regarding his impending federal prison term, and the public disgrace brought upon his family. Financial auditors cross-referenced his bank records with the federal indictment files, confirming that the impending legal collapse was the central catalyst driving his actions. Because the perpetrator died during the event, no criminal prosecution took place. However, the comprehensive investigation officially closed the case, establishing Sueppel as the sole party responsible for the domestic crime and subsequent arson. The Steven Sueppel case serves as a profound warning regarding the dangerous intersection of white-collar crime, acute public shame, and severe domestic vulnerability. It demonstrates how sudden financial collapse and the threat of long-term incarceration can trigger catastrophic crises in individuals who appear completely stable to their communities. The case underscores the critical necessity for legal institutions, corporate auditors, and crisis intervention services to recognize the severe domestic risk factors that can emerge during high-stakes financial indictments, emphasizing the life-saving importance of early psychological evaluation and active intervention when individuals face total personal and professional ruin. Case 7, Paul Canero. At 5:01 a.m. on November 20, 2018, emergency crews responded to a fire at a residence in Ocean Township, New Jersey, owned by 51-year-old technology executive Paul Canero. Paul and his immediate family stood safely outside as firefighters suppressed the flames. Less than 7 hours later at 12:38 p.m., a second, far more catastrophic fire erupted 12 miles away at an estate in Colts Neck, New Jersey. The property belonged to Paul's younger brother and primary business partner, 50-year-old Keith Caneiro. When emergency responders arrived, they discovered Keith deceased on the front lawn, while his 45-year-old wife, Jennifer, and their 2 young children, 11-year-old Jesse and 8-year-old Sophia, were found deceased inside the burning residence. Within days, what initially appeared to be a tragic coincidence linking 2 brother executives transformed into one of the most complex financial and violent crime investigations in modern New Jersey history. To understand how a decades-long partnership between 2 successful brothers devolved into extreme violence, we have to examine the financial tension and corporate fraud unfolding behind their joint business ventures. Born and raised in Brooklyn, Paul and Keith Caneiro built a close professional relationship over several decades. Keith was an ambitious, highly capable entrepreneur who founded a successful technology consulting firm and a specialized restoration business named Square One Electric. Recognizing his elder brother's technical skills, Keith brought Paul on as a co-owner and executive officer, granting him extensive access to company accounts, payroll systems, and corporate credit lines. Outwardly, both brothers enjoyed affluent suburban lifestyles. Keith lived in a prominent mansion in Colts Neck, while Paul maintained a high-end residence in Ocean Township. They presented the image of a thriving, supportive family business. However, beneath the surface of their partnership, Paul was quietly engaging in extensive corporate fraud. Over a period of several years, Paul systematically siphoned company funds from Square One Electric to cover personal expenses, mounting personal debts, and lifestyle upkeep. Because the business was closely held between family members, routine independent financial audits were omitted, allowing Paul's embezzlement to go undetected for years. The early warning signs emerged in late 2018 when Keith began noticing unexplained cash flow shortages and accounting discrepancies within the company's operating funds. Keith, who managed client relations and business development, began questioning internal financial statements. On November 19, 2018, the day before the incidents, Keith confronted Paul regarding missing funds, informing his brother that he was cutting off Paul's access to corporate accounts and initiating an independent financial audit. Faced with total financial exposure, imminent public disgrace, and criminal liability for embezzlement, Paul formulated a plan to eliminate his brother's family and cover his tracks. On the night of November 19, Paul traveled to Keith's Colts Neck home, carrying out a planned attack against Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. He then set fire to the mansion to destroy physical evidence. To create a cover story and suggest that an outside entity was targeting the Caneiro family, Paul returned to his own Ocean Township home early the next morning, poured gasoline in the basement, and set his own residence ablaze while his wife and daughters were inside, pretending to be a fellow victim of an unknown attacker. Homicide detectives, state police arson investigators, and forensic accountants from the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office initiated a massive joint investigation. The physical evidence gathered at both crime scenes quickly dismantled Paul's diversionary cover story. Arson technicians analyzing the Ocean Township fire recovered gasoline cans, burnt rags, and charred gloves hidden near Paul's property. Surveillance video from surrounding neighborhood cameras captured Paul's vehicle traveling toward and returning from Colts Neck during the precise window of the crimes. Forensic examination of the Colts Neck estate yielded physical evidence directly linking Paul to the location before the fire was ignited. Simultaneously, forensic financial auditors examined the accounts of Square One Electric. The paper trail revealed indisputable evidence that Paul had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the business, providing prosecutors with a clear, documented financial motive. Paul Canero was arrested and charged with 16 felony counts, including 4 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated arson, theft, and corporate fraud. Following years of extensive pretrial litigation and forensic motions, Paul stood trial in Monmouth County Superior Court. The prosecution presented a formidable case combining digital vehicle tracking, physical arson evidence, and meticulous financial audits demonstrating deliberate calculation. The defense argued third-party involvement, but the jury rejected the claims. Paul Canero was convicted on all 16 counts. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus an additional 18 years for arson and financial crimes. The Paul Canero case stands as a chilling study in corporate fraud and domestic betrayal. It underscores the vital necessity of independent financial audits and objective oversight in family-owned businesses, proving that unaddressed financial fraud can escalate into catastrophic consequences when accountability is finally enforced. Case 8. Paul Dennis Reid Jr. Between February and April 1997, a terrifying series of violent commercial robberies gripped Middle Tennessee, leaving small business owners and commercial workers in a state of constant fear. Over a 67-day span, 7 restaurant employees were systematically targeted during routine closing operations across Metro Nashville and Clarksville. The victims included Sarah Jackson and Steve Hampton at a Captain D's restaurant, Ronald Santiago, Andrea Brown, and Robert Sewell at a McDonald's, and Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace at a Baskin-Robbins store. The recurring pattern of quiet commercial establishments being targeted right before opening or immediately after closing pointed to a methodical, cold-blooded perpetrator executing calculated commercial hits. To understand how a single individual terrorized an entire metropolitan region, we have to examine the offender's criminal background, escalating violent behavior, and history of antisocial conduct. Born in 1957 in Texas, Paul Dennis Reid Jr. demonstrated early antisocial tendencies and a complete disregard for legal authority. In his early 20s, he engaged in violent crimes, resulting in a conviction for armed robbery in Texas, where he served a lengthy prison sentence. Following his release on parole, Reid relocated to Middle Tennessee in the mid-1990s, attempting to pursue a career in country music while working low-wage jobs at local commercial establishments. Outwardly, Reid attempted to maintain the appearance of an aspiring musician seeking a fresh start. However, beneath his public persona lay severe emotional volatility, intense paranoia, and deep personal resentment over his economic standing and failed ambitions. Reid struggled to maintain steady employment, getting fired from multiple jobs due to volatile outbursts, erratic behavior, and conflicts with supervisors. His financial situation deteriorated rapidly throughout early 1997. Having previously served time for armed robbery, Reid knew the operational routines of fast food restaurants, including cash handling procedures, shift changes, and vulnerable closing hours. Rather than seeking legal employment, he decided to utilize his knowledge of commercial operations to commit high-stakes robberies. The early warning signs were evident in his escalating paranoia and pattern of workplace threats. Neighbors and former coworkers noted his erratic temperament and fascination with weapons. As his financial desperation deepened in early 1997, Reid planned a series of targeted armed robberies against fast food outlets, deciding in advance to eliminate all witnesses to avoid identification and parole revocation. On February 16, 1997, Reid executed his first attack at a Captain D's in Nashville, targeting workers Sarah Jackson and Steve Hampton before opening hours. 5 weeks later, on March 23, he struck a McDonald's in Nashville, forcing employees into a walk-in cooler, taking the lives of Ronald Santiago, Andrea Brown, and Robert Sewell, while a 4th employee miraculously survived despite critical injuries. Exactly 1 month later, on April 23, Reid kidnapped Baskin-Robbins workers Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace from a Clarksville store, carrying out a fatal attack in a nearby park. The surviving McDonald's employee provided Metro Nashville police detectives with a crucial eyewitness description of the assailant. Law enforcement agencies formed a multi-jurisdictional task force comprising Metro Nashville Police, Clarksville Police, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI to cross-reference evidence across all three crime scenes. Forensic technicians from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Laboratory conducted extensive ballistic examinations on recovered shell casings and bullet fragments. The ballistics testing yielded a definitive breakthrough. Markings on the projectiles recovered from all three locations matched a single firearm, proving that a single perpetrator was responsible for all 7 crimes. Investigators systematically cross-referenced local employment records, background checks, and parole registries. They identified 39-year-old Paul Dennis Reid Jr. as a former employee who fit the physical description and possessed a criminal history involving armed robbery. On June 25, 1997, task force officers placed Reid under surveillance and arrested him after he attempted to assault his former landlord. A search of his vehicle and residence yielded physical evidence, connecting him directly to the robbery scenes. The state of Tennessee prosecuted Reid across 3 separate trials in Nashville and Clarksville. Prosecutors presented overwhelming forensic evidence, including ballistic matches, physical evidence, and the positive identification from the surviving McDonald's worker. The juries across all 3 trials rejected defense motions regarding his mental state, finding Reid guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder. The courts imposed 7 death sentences. Reid remained on death row for 16 years, filing numerous appeals, before dying in state custody from natural medical causes on November 1, 2013, at age 55. The Paul Dennis Reid Jr. case fundamentally transformed commercial security protocols across the retail and restaurant industries. It prompted national changes in workplace safety standards, including the mandatory implementation of time-delayed safes, real-time surveillance camera coverage, dual employee closing requirements, and silent panic alarms, establishing critical safeguards to protect commercial workers from violent crime. Case 9, Charles Joseph Whitman. Shortly after 11:30 a.m. on August 1, 1966, a 25-year-old disguised as a maintenance worker hauled a heavy footlocker filled with firearms, ammunition, and survival gear onto the observation deck of the University of Texas Tower in Austin. Over the course of the next 96 minutes, he unleashed an unprecedented long-range attack on the university campus and surrounding city streets below. When the siege finally ended, 16 innocent individuals had lost their lives, 31 others were injured, and a nation was forced to confront a terrifying new dimension of public violence. To understand how an intelligent college student and decorated former Marine transformed into the perpetrator of a historic mass attack, we must examine the hidden neurological crisis, an intense internal struggle unfolding behind his disciplined exterior. Born in 1941 in Florida, Charles Joseph Whitman was raised in a strict household dominated by an overbearing, highly demanding father who enforced rigid perfectionism and complete obedience. Charles excelled in multiple areas, becoming an Eagle Scout at a young age and later enlisting in the United States Marine Corps, where he earned a sharpshooter badge. Following his military service, he married his wife, Kathleen, enrolled at the University of Texas to study architectural engineering, and built an outwardly respectable life. To his peers and neighbors, Whitman appeared to be the personification of American success: athletic, polite, capable, and ambitious. However, beneath this polished exterior, Whitman's mental and emotional state began deteriorating rapidly in late 1965. He started experiencing severe, inexplicable headaches, overwhelming bouts of irrational anger, and intense, violent impulses that terrified him because they contradicted his core personal values. Recognizing that something was profoundly wrong inside his mind, Whitman took proactive steps to seek professional help. In March 1966, he visited a university psychiatrist, explicitly describing overwhelming urges to climb the campus tower with a rifle. Despite these clear warning signs, the medical consultation yielded no follow-up treatment, specialized brain scans, or active intervention, leaving Whitman isolated as his neurological condition continued to degrade. By late July 1966, Whitman felt completely overwhelmed by his uncharacteristic urges. On the night of July 31, he sat at his typewriter and composed a detailed suicide note. In it, he expressed deep confusion over his violent thoughts, requested that an autopsy be performed on his brain after his death to identify any organic abnormalities, and expressed his love for his family. In the early morning hours of August 1, Whitman traveled to his mother Margaret's apartment and took her life. He then returned home and took the life of his sleeping wife, Kathleen. He left notes beside their bodies explaining that he sought to spare them the public shame and pain of the attack he felt compelled to carry out later that day. At 11:38 a.m., Whitman reached the top of the University of Texas Tower, killed 3 people inside the building, and stepped onto the 28th floor observation deck. Positioning himself behind the stone ramparts, he utilized his military marksmanship to target pedestrians, students, and first responders across a multi-block radius. The local police response was severely hampered by a complete lack of tactical equipment, specialized training, and centralized communication. Officers arriving at the scene had only standard handguns and shotguns, which were ineffective against a fortified shooter elevated 28 stories above the ground. Seeing the police struggle, dozens of armed civilian bystanders retrieved hunting rifles from their vehicles and returned fire toward the tower, pinning Whitman down and restricting his ability to aim cleanly. Recognizing that the siege could only end from within, Austin police officers Ramiro Ray Martinez and Houston McCoy, along with Officer Alan Crum and civilian Richard Elkins, maneuvered up the interior stairwells. At 1:24 p.m., Martinez and McCoy breached the observation deck, confronted Whitman, and neutralized him, bringing the 96-minute attack to an immediate end. Following the incident, medical examiners fulfilled Whitman's written request and performed an autopsy. Neurologists discovered a malignant brain tumor, a glioblastoma multiforme, also classified as an astrocytoma, pressing directly against his amygdala, the brain region responsible for regulating emotion, fear, and behavioral control. While medical panels debated the precise degree to which the tumor dictated his actions, consensus acknowledged that the organic lesion likely contributed to his sudden, uncontrollable personality shift and violent urges. The Charles Whitman case fundamentally revolutionized American law enforcement protocols. The operational failures exposed during the tower response directly catalyzed the birth of modern SWAT units, specialized tactical training, and improved police communications across the United States. It stands as an enduring historical lesson in the critical importance of taking sudden neurological and psychological shifts seriously, providing a powerful precedent for modern active shooter prevention and mental health intervention.